This lecture discusses Chapter 8, Primate Life Histories and the Evolution of Intelligence. As we discussed several lectures ago, some of the features that define primates have to do with their big brains, their long lifespans, and the consequences of these characteristics. Primates mature slowly and thus have long juvenile periods in which their large brains can absorb a tremendous amount of information that they learn from watching others in the group. These learned behaviors provide the foundation for behavioral flexibility, a characteristic of primates that allows them to modify their behavior depending on the particular circumstance in which they find themselves. In addition, primates live long lives. It turns out that across all mammals, the brain size or the size of the brain is correlated with lifespan. Brain tissue is energetically quite expensive to grow. So it is reasonable to hypothesize that large brains are not just a byproduct of selection on longevity. Instead, selection has favored an allocation of energy toward an increase in brain size, because it conferred a real advantage. The reasons for this will be discussed shortly. In the meantime, let's think about the evolutionary forces that shape the length and timing of the different parts of the life cycle of mammals, which is called life history theory. Life history theory is all about trade-offs. So, do you invest more energy in your current offspring or future offspring? Do you have fewer offspring and invest heavily in them? Or do you have many offspring and invest less in each one? We've discussed some of these trade-offs already in the context of primate mating systems, and remember that these are evolved strategies, not conscious decisions made by an organism. There are also trade-offs in how an individual allocates energy. Do you use energy for growth and maintenance or for reproduction? Remember, in mammals, energy toward reproduction in females involves access to resources. In males, it often involves competitions to gain access to females. There is tremendous variation in how this all plays out in mammals. For instance, the opossum sexually matures in 1 year, can have large litters up to twice per year, and dies usually around the age of 3. Elephants, in stark contrast, can take 10 years to sexually mature, gestate a single calf for 22 months, do not become pregnant again for another 5 to 10 years, and live for decades. Why don't opossums mature later and live longer lives? Why don't elephants have larger litters? We will try to answer these questions in just a moment, but for now, just consider that these questions boil down to an understanding that there's always a limited amount of energy available, and that energy allocation toward reproduction comes at an expense of growth and maintenance, and vice versa. Investment in current offspring comes at the expense of preparing for future offspring. And while one can invest plenty in small litters, it is nearly impossible to have intense parental investment in larger litters of offspring. Selection has favored, and continues to favor, different life history strategies depending on what maximizes reproductive success for the particular species. So your blanks for this slide are quantity and quality for the first two, and current and future reproduction for the second. So life history theory can help us understand why we experience senescence, which is aging, like this old male chimpanzee, and eventually die. Dying certainly does not increase one's reproductive success, so why has it evolved? Certainly, wear and tear can take its toll on an organism over the years, and one could argue that senescence is simply a byproduct of that. However, wounds heal and bones mend, so why doesn't selection favor better-built organisms that either never break down or at least break down more slowly? Once again, we have to remind ourselves that there's a limited amount of energy that can be obtained by an organism. Investment of this energy toward growth and maintenance comes at the expense of energy for reproduction. Selection has, for the most part, favored organisms that allocate energy toward their fertility, and this comes at the expense of growth and maintenance. Aging is therefore partly a consequence of selection favoring genes that increase one's fitness early in life at the expense of their fitness later in life. In the genetics lecture, we discussed pleiotropic genes, or you learned about it by reading the book. And so pleiotropic genes have multiple effects. A gene may help produce a phenotype that increases reproductive success early in life, and thus would be favored by selection and passed on to the next generation. However, this very same gene may produce a phenotype that reduces one's fitness later in life. Selection cannot work against this gene because its early benefits ensure that it will be passed on, regardless of the negative consequence later in life. High testosterone levels in primates is a classic example of this, which is the example at the bottom of the slide. Though testosterone may help reproductive success in young males, high levels of testosterone ultimately lowers lifespan in male mammals. So the first blank is pleiotropic and the second one is testosterone. Because of the trade-off between current and future offspring, life history traits are clustered together in the manner shown here. Animals that reproduce early divert energy away from their growth and maintenance and toward reproduction, so they remain small with small brains, and they tend to have large litters and short lifespans. So that's characterized as a fast life history, whereas a slow life history is the list on the right. So these individuals may invest more in maintenance and growth, and so they tend to be larger and they reproduce later in life. Primates also have very long life histories. They have slow maturation, large brains, and long gestations. They have smaller litters and long lifespans. However, there's a lot of variation within primates. So within the primate clade, we find great variation in life history strategies. So for instance, monkeys tend to have slower life history strategies than the strepsirrhines, and apes tend to have even longer and slower life histories than the monkeys. Within the apes, orangutans have particularly slow life histories with the longest interbirth interval, which is the time between births, and that's about 7 years. So let's talk about why large brains evolved, because this is a characteristic of primates. There are a few hypotheses, but the first one is the social intelligence hypothesis, which is your first blank. The second one is behavioral flexibility, and the third blank is ecological, for ecological challenges. So compared to other mammals of similar size, primates have very large brains. But given how energetically costly it is to grow a large brain, one must ask the question, why did large brains evolve? Researchers investigating this question have looked at two non-exclusive explanations for the evolution of the large brain in primates. So a primate's life is quite challenging. Primates need to compete for food and access for mates, and they need to know who is who in groups that are often very large, as shown in the slide with the gelada baboons. Those with slightly larger brains may be able to navigate this complex social world of primates a bit better than those with smaller brains, and therefore be better able to gain the food resources and social connections that lead to more reproductive success. This selective scenario is called the social intelligence hypothesis. Another set of hypotheses considers the ecological challenges that confront primates and the behavioral flexibility necessary to solve novel problems. First, many primates are frugivores, which means they eat fruit, and fruit is often distributed widely and patchily through the forest. Those primates with slightly larger brains may be able to remember the locations of high-quality patches of food and form mental maps to best navigate those spots. A second version of the ecological challenge hypothesis is known as the extractive foraging hypothesis. Many species of primates rely on foods that have to be processed in some way, like this green monkey puncturing an eggshell. Primates crack open nuts and extract insects from wood, and these actions may select for a slightly larger, better organized brain. The behavioral flexibility hypothesis helps explain why primates can cope with new challenges, or how they can. Those with larger brains may be able to think up better ideas than others when trying to cope with either social or ecological dilemmas. Many of these new solutions may be innovations by a single individual, but then spread to others because of the important role that learning has in young primates. Those with larger brains may be able to not only have the behavioral flexibility to come up with solutions to new problems, but also to adapt to solutions that others have come up with into their own behavioral repertoire. For example, one of the pioneers in chimpanzee cognitive research, Wolfgang Kohler, challenged a group of chimpanzees by hanging bananas out of reach. Eventually, as you can see in this image, one chimpanzee figured out how to reach the bananas by stacking crates. The behavioral flexibility hypothesis proposes that the large brain of primates evolved to come up with solutions like this, but in the wild rather than a lab setting. Fortunately, these hypotheses about the evolution of intelligence in the large primate brain can be tested using comparative data. One would expect to find a relatively larger brain in species that have more social complexity if the social intelligence hypothesis is the cause of encephalization in primates. Those primates that engage in more extractive foraging behavior or face more ecological challenges should have proportionately larger brains if behavioral flexibility has selected for primate intelligence. In testing these hypotheses, researchers have focused not just on the size of the brain, but also on the relative size of a particular part of the brain, which is the neocortex, that is your blank. This requires us to look into the brain structure in a bit more detail. Neurobiologists have found that the neocortex is the part of the brain most associated with problem solving and behavioral flexibility, and thus that part of the brain is relevant to our discussion on primate intelligence. To measure the relative size of the neocortex, the ratio of this part of the brain to the volume of the entire brain is taken. This is called the neocortex ratio. It turns out that the neocortex ratio is correlated with group size in primates, which is pretty interesting. So the data support the social intelligence hypothesis. However, the neocortex ratio is also higher in species that have large home ranges and have a large percentage of fruit in their diet, also supporting that ecological factors have driven brain evolution in primates. Studies also show that primates that have been observed coming up with novel solutions to problems, whether they be social learning or tool use, have relatively larger parts of their brains devoted to higher thinking. It is interesting that primates like gorillas seem to be much more flexible in their foraging behavior than their social behavior. So the take-home message is that data suggests that non-human primates seem to have more intelligence in regards to foraging rather than socializing, based on some other research. So apes are strikingly intelligent and have relatively larger brain compared to their body size than monkeys do. However, apes live in smaller groups than most monkey species. So gorillas, for instance, live in groups of a dozen or so, and orangutans are the most solitary of the catarrhines. So this observation is significant, and it's a challenge to the social intelligence hypothesis. However, what we do see in apes is an impressive array of extractive foraging techniques, including the construction and use of tools. Chimps have been observed since Jane Goodall's time to use long reeds as devices to fish termites out of their holes. They also use bunched up leaves as sponges to soak up water to drink. As shown in this image on the bottom, chimpanzees can use stones to crack open nuts, and there's just so many more examples of that in primates. So anyway, this is the end of our lecture for today, but as you can see, there are some interesting hypotheses for brain size in humans and primates, and just some support for how we have a slow life history strategy.